In the previous lesson on the blind brain, we learned that blind individuals do indeed have a functioning mentalizing system, and the parts of that system seem to be in the same locations as in sighted brains. For example, the right TPJ is an active part of the mentalizing system in the blind brain, and it also shows the same kind of response profile, the same kind of selectivity as in sighted people. So right TPJ shows high activity for stories that involve other people having thoughts and beliefs, not when other people are having sensations, not when the story is about some physical thing, not when it's just about facts about people, but rather there has to be some reference to the thoughts and beliefs of another person. So how does then the system get set up if it's been deprived of a major source of input, the visual input in the blind brain? And researchers argue that a key input to the mentalizing system are the language systems. And of course, blind brains are developing in a rich linguistic environment. Through the auditory channel, blind individuals will be communicating with speech with all kinds of folks in their linguistic environment. They will be talking about mental states and how mental states relate to the world. So the language systems here are going to be a critical part of setting up the mentalizing system. And we'll see in this lesson some more evidence that supports that, both from blind brains and from deaf brains, which we'll look at right now. So consider the deaf brain. So here we have the interruption in a different sensory channel, so the auditory sensory channel, and that really does have a severe impact in communication, because we get so much of our, we do so much of our communication through the auditory channel just by speaking with each other. Of course, deaf individuals can learn a visual form of language called sign language. And we'll see then that that kind of language acquisition can be a source of input to the mentalizing system. So in both the blind brain and the deaf brain, the key will be, will there be language acquisition sufficient to be able to set up this mentalizing system? Now, the evidence for the role of language in setting up the mentalizing system comes from several sort of observations. So let's consider up top here in the diagram. Here we have a developing brain, a 3-year-old brain, 5-year-old brain, and you recall that behavioral measure, the false belief task. 3-year-olds fail that task. 5-year-olds can pass that. And the suggestion was that the brain is maturing over this time period so that the mentalizing system comes online in a way that allows the 5-year-old to pass the false belief task, whereas the 3-year-old cannot. Well, what about blindness? Does blindness impact this developmental progression? So for congenital blindness, in fact, there is a delay. There's a delay. On average, the congenitally blind individuals are delayed in passing the false belief task by about a year or so. And that suggests that the visual input to the mentalizing system does play a role. It facilitates the acquisition of mentalizing skills, but it's not necessary. So the blind brain will still be able to set up a mentalizing system even without visual input. Nevertheless, the blindness does cause a delay. Now, what about deaf children? First, let's consider deaf children to hearing parents. Now, hearing parents typically have not learned sign language. So in these families, the deaf children are born into a family where there's not a whole lot of communication going on, right? So it's difficult for hearing parents who don't know sign language to be communicating with their deaf child. And sure enough, they too show a delay in the passage of the false belief task. So it's as if, in this case, perhaps a delay in language acquisition is causing this delay here. Now, what happens if the deaf child is born into a family of deaf parents who have likely learned or have learned sign language? Well, when the communication can start early on about the world and the child and mental states and everything that hearing parents would be talking about with their children, when deaf parents can sign with their deaf children, sure enough, they pass the false belief task like hearing children do. Finally, one more piece of evidence, if you just sort of look at 4-year-olds, some of whom can pass the false belief task, some not, and you just sort of, within that group, you look at linguistic ability and you plot linguistic ability on the x-axis here and the likelihood of passing the false belief task, you get a correlation. So in other words, those 4-year-olds who have greater linguistic ability are more likely to pass the false belief task. In fact, there's even some research that shows that having a lot of siblings, so growing up in a family with many siblings, accelerates the passage of the false belief test. It's as if when you have a lot of linguistic experience, people talking about the world and mental states and how they relate to the world, it seems to be setting up the mentalizing system a little more quickly. So the data from blind and deaf individuals suggests that the delay in theory of mind development may be related to a delay in language acquisition. As children get more experience talking about mental states and how they relate to the world, they become more proficient in tasks like the false belief task. In fact, people who are deaf and blind can mentalize, for example, Helen Keller, provided they acquire a language, right, with terms that refer to mental states. So you'll recall Helen Keller's story here where her tutor finally made the breakthrough that these symbols, these hand symbols, were letters that spelled words, and words referred to things in the world. Once that insight was achieved, Helen Keller went on to develop excellent language competence and was able to mentalize, right? So in summary then, Sachs and her colleagues argue that the right TPJ may represent other people's thoughts in an abstract propositional code that can be acquired without first-person experience of a particular mode of sensation. So you can be deaf or you could be blind, right? But the mentalizing system can be set up provided you have relevant linguistic experiences. So she's kind of arguing that the TPJ here is encoding other people's thoughts in a kind of a propositional code related to a sort of a linguistic competence. And this is why then blind individuals are not permanently disabled in mentalizing, because they can be acquiring linguistic competence. This is why deaf individuals are not permanently impaired in mentalizing if they have sufficient language experience.